I found over the years, the White Album, just listening to it time and again, I found myself sort of zeroing in on a lot of John's tracks. So I just thought, wow, this is where he peaked, just the breadth, the depth, the variety of material, the personal nature of it. And then it occurred to me, there's a full album in this. There are 12 tracks. If we add the single, the B-side Revolution, then it's 13. So I count up McCartney's tracks, exactly the same number. And I thought, wow, I wonder, if we just basically isolate those tracks, separate them. And I created playlists, John Lennon's White Album, Paul McCartney's White Album. And they were just like absolutely amazing, just blew me away. And so that's where this started.
You remember the philosophy that the Beatles are now serving as each other's sidemen, and it was basically almost like a solo album. I don't think we were coming from that standpoint at all.
Not at all.
Especially with the new release. I mean, anyone listening to these tracks understands this is the tightest band in the world. So the sidemen thing wasn't really the inspiration behind this. It was just more like, oh my God, these are just fantastic standalone albums. Maybe a little less fantastic for George and Ringo, but certainly Paul and John, could have put these things out. And then the challenge became, well, how would you order them? What would you do if you excluded all of the other White Album songs by the other players? Would it still hold up, or what would it be?
So we did 3 episodes. We did do a John Lennon's White Album, Paul McCartney's, and then we did a George and Ringo one. Here we're just sticking to the John and Paul angle because those are the 2 strongest albums as such, without a doubt. I mean, what was your attitude when you first heard this concept that I sort of told you about?
Actually, it was one that I'd been thinking about already, in particular with reference to John, because he comes out fighting in 68.
Yeah.
Post Rishikesh, the end of Rishikesh is obviously a turning point for John. And then there's that moment which Derek Taylor wrote about it in 1 or 2 of his books, which was that Derek came back from LA to help run Apple in April 68. And he and John were always very close, much closer than he was to Paul. And they have an evening, Derek rents a house, or he borrows the house that Peter Asher has in Surrey, which is unused. And they have an evening where Derek and John take LSD together. And John, as he said in the Wenner interview, had been dismantling his own ego with so many LSD trips in 67 that he needed to be built back up again.
Yeah.
And Derek spent some of that evening reminding him of some of the songs he'd written through the years, but not only the songs, but the man that he was, and how he had never suffered any fools, how he had been completely no bullshit from, before Derek knew him, back to his childhood years. So after that evening, John is John restored. And with that and the end of the way that Rishikesh ended, he's up and fighting again. And there seems to me there's a clear watershed moment in John Lennon's life, which is, I'm back to being who I used to be.
Right.
He's like the art school John Lennon again. He's not going to take any shit from anyone.
Right.
And when he goes to New York in May 68, he and Paul go to New York and they announce Apple. And he actually says, we're setting up a company so that people don't have to go down on their hands and knees in someone's office, probably yours. Which is a highly belligerent thing to say, but completely where he was. He says, no nonsense of any kind. It's just like, this is it. I'm going to say what I think and you're going to get it. And if you don't like it, fine. That's what Two Virgins is. It's like, here we are. If you don't like it, don't look at it. But this is who I am. So from that point on, I'm thinking, well, John Lennon's White Album. Yeah, I mean, every track on it is, if that was a John Lennon solo album, it would just be the greatest album you'd ever heard.
Absolutely.
It would be up there with the Plastic Ono Band album, only even more approachable and more melodic.
Yeah.
So I have been thinking it, but when I heard your 3 shows, which was about 6 baths for me, because I only listen when I'm in the bath.
As I'd expect.
I might be late, but I'm very clean.
And well-informed as well.
Yeah, and well-informed, very well-informed.
And now we'll never get this out of our minds when we do future shows.
That's okay, then I thought, it really made me think. It's very stimulating to actually look at them individually and see where they were, not only as musicians, but particularly as composers.
Well, having done the last show, I thought the concept was really interesting. In this case, we have to give George and Ringo short shrift, but, because and it's a pity because George's stuff is some of the best stuff on the White Album. I'm not sure I would say that "Don't Pass Me By" and the vocal on "Goodnight" are necessarily the best stuff on the White Album, but they're part of the White Album.
Yeah.
It's the Beatles, the White Album. It's great. Shut up, as Paul says.
Yeah.
So. The idea of a John album, I agree with Mark. It would have, if it were a John solo album, it really would have been the best John solo album. It's, with John solo albums and certainly with Paul solo albums, there are peaks and valleys.
Yeah.
And this is pretty much all peaks.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
It would be an amazing album.
Yeah.
Now, what about the Paul album? That one is very eclectic.
Even more eclectic than the John one would be.
I just don't think it's as consistent necessarily, although it's fantastic in its own way.
It is, and there are some valleys there, although the valleys are not particularly low.
Right.
And since my mission in life now seems to be trying to get people to listen to the 5.1 mix. The first time I played that and heard "Why Don't We Do It in the Road," which is a song that just doesn't mean a lot to me. It's an okay, quick throwaway track, but you listen to it in 5.1 and there's the arpeggiated guitar and the piano and the bass line and the sort of drum beat and his really incredible vocal. All around you, and you're totally in this texture, and I'm thinking this really sounds and feels like a masterpiece, and it's still just "Why Don't We Do It in the Road?" So it's not as consistent as John's, but even the not amazing stuff is it's a lot of fun. I mean, Wild Honey Pie's fun, really.
Yeah.
And it's really those two tracks that I think are a bit lower than the rest. Maybe Martha, My Dear, a little. There's a bit of the middle of Martha, My Dear.
I love Martha, My Dear. What are you talking about?
Yeah, I like it. It's good.
Sorry.
I mean, if we're talking about, what has to be peaks and valleys. Martha, My Dear, what I dislike about Martha, My Dear?
What?
Only is the middle section, the instrumental part. It sounds to me like it really wants to be "Let Him In."
Well, I mean, I think there's a big difference, but I think everyone here would agree with me. It's probably the prettiest song ever written about a dog.
Absolutely.
Shannon, close. Shannon's close second, yes. Well, this is going to the dogs, so we should get away from that now. I couldn't help it.
Is it about a dog?
Well, you and I had this discussion.
Is it about Jane?
Well,
please.
We don't
She's not
know.
a dog.
I mean, we just don't know. I mean, why did he name his dog Martha? Was it after somebody, and this song is after that? This song is about that person, and so was the dog. Mm. I mean, it's hold your hand out, you pretty girl, not hold your paw out, right? So,
You know what? I never thought of that.
Hidden in plain sight. That,
it's the same number of syllables as Francie, but it has more of a lilt.
Ooh. Francie, my dear. If you read Francie's book, I think you'll find that wasn't quite the way their relationship was.
Okay. But, I was going to say, with the new White Album out, one of the few criticisms we had about it was the idea that, hey, where's the visual component? And when I know, Mark, when you and I have looked through some of the film that Apple has, Francie shows up in some of the really key parts of it, and I wonder if that had something to do with it, because if you got Paul McCartney sitting at the base of the stairs, going up to the control room of Studio 2, and he's tapping along, and he's playing Helter Skelter. Maybe Francie's presence in those films is part of why we didn't get them. That's just a theory.
Do you have definitive running orders for each of these? You said it keeps evolving.
Yeah, I don't really have a definitive one. I mean, actually, looking at the John one, I pretty much have it in the order it appears.
Yeah, me too.
I wouldn't begin with Dear Prudence because it's not necessarily an album opener, but Revolution 1 could be. In fact, I have mine beginning with Revolution 1, ending with Revolution 9.
I have mine starting with Everybody's Got Something to Hide.
Yeah, that could do it.
Yeah.
let's see, we go with Revolution, Prudence, Glass Onion, Bungalow Bill, Happiness is a Warm Gun, Then Your Blues, I'm So Tired, Julia, Good Night, Me and My Monkey, Cry Baby, Revolution 9.
Where was the break there? I mean, end of side one, start of side two.
Well, mine's a CD. I was thinking of it of like the side 2-ish thing would start with Your Blues, but that kind of puts an awful lot on side 2. Maybe side 1 could end with So Tired. I could switch So Tired and Your Blues and have, Bungalow Bill, Happiness is a Warm Gun, I'm So Tired. But Happiness is a Warm Gun is a great ender for a side, as we know, and then start with Your Blues on side 2, skip directly to Julia.
I was looking at the double White Album, and Paul starts 3 sides and John starts 1. Mm-hmm. And for the closing tracks, I think it's John has 3 and George has 1. So there isn't a Paul song that closes any of the sides. Because it was always a key part of the pacing of an album, was how you would open and close each side.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they're real junction points. And George Martin always instilled in them how you had to have a strong out. Yeah. And a strong in and a strong out.
Yeah, I mean, as Chris Thomas said, that had to be a hell of an album to sequence.
Yeah.
Incredible, really, that they made it without another big argument.
Yeah.
I remember when we did the original show, I had one idea that I really stuck with, which is I would have expanded the horizon just a little bit, especially for John's album. And I would have included the World Wildlife Fund version of Across the Universe, because it was really the last things they were recording before they went off to Maharishi's ashram. And I thought thematically for me, John was looking for Daddy, and there is so much enthusiasm in that song underlying, Jai Guru Day. And I would have ended the album, second to last would have been Revolution 9, but the last song for me, for John, would have been Sexy Sadie, because he's back to being disappointed in the search for Daddy. So it was kind of a circular journey. And everything else in between, I keep changing it around. It's like when we used to make Smile albums, because it's like, nah, this works better. But those two, those are my big anchor points. Is I would have that wildlife version of Across the Universe and end with Sexy Sadie. Everything else in there can kind of be in play.
Right. And Alan, you've got this interesting concept of the 3 revolutions and how it all ties together. Maybe you could explain that. Also, I was interested in the last show about Can You Take Me Back, which you hear it actually as the start of Revolution 9, which I never did.
Apparently nobody ever does, including the people who sequence the tracks and always put it with, so I guess maybe it isn't, but I had always heard it that way. And so I'm not married to that idea.
But what about the 3 revolutions?
Well, the 3 revolutions, the idea is, he started, obviously he didn't intend it as a trilogy or a triptych, but it became one. And the way I hear it in a nutshell is you've got the sort of slow, laconic Revolution 1 where, it's just kind of dreamy. He's just sort of contemplating the revolution because there's all this revolution in the air and he's thinking about it. And it gets to that line when you talk about destruction, that you can count me out, which on the Escher demo and on the song manuscript just says out. Here he adds in. And he always explained he just wasn't really sure how he felt about it. Later in the sequence, you get the single version of Revolution, which we know was recorded to be a single because George and Paul didn't think that the slow, laid-back acoustic one would be a good single, so he did a fast one. But where that fits in the trilogy idea is, okay, now things are heating up. It's getting more dangerous. It's getting more, and the danger of it is kind of signaled in the fact that it's a loud electric track with distorted guitars and faster. Also higher key, not in the way they recorded it. They recorded it in the same key, but it was sped up, half a step. So, you get a greater sense of urgency. And then you get to Revolution 9, and that's the revolution. That's just society falling apart. You hear gunshots, you hear disconnections, you hear just crazy stuff going on. And have I mentioned about the 5.1 mix? The 5.1 mix is just like all over the place, and really kind of puts you in the middle of that revolution. And you know, except that you don't really want to get out. You know?
Right. Yeah, you want to keep immersing yourself in it.
Yeah, and it ends with the soccer chants, all that line block, that kick. The whole world was going through an awful lot with student protests, and including everything that happened at the Democratic National Convention that August.
Yeah.
Just a couple of days after the single of Revolution was released, but months before the album was released. One of the big things I remember from watching the coverage of that at the time was people out, protesting, chanting, "The whole world is watching, the whole world is watching." I kind of wish John had gotten that recording and made that the end of Revolution 9 instead of the soccer.
Right.
I'm sorry. Football chants.
Football.
Actually, it's American football.
Really?
Yeah, it's an American recording.
No kidding.
Yeah, it is.
I don't remember hearing that
It's
as an actual
one of
football game.
It's one of the Elektra sound effects records.
No kidding.
Yeah, Jack
Wow.
Holtzman. Yeah.
That's the thing with the White Album with John, as you said, we're getting full on Lennon here. And I mean, just the different sort of targets that he's swiping at, and he's hitting them every time.
Yeah.
And, vocally, he's on fire. We get so many fantastic vocals on his songs. But for me, and also in the remix version, what really came out and in the outtakes is Julia. Just such an incredible vocal. It's so fragile, so loving and tender and haunting at the same time. And that you really hear on the recording itself, a bit of the reverb on the voice.
Also, one thing I really love about John's work on this album is he seems to be back to this, taking what's around him, not a show tune like from when they were in their earlier days, but having learned that picking style while he's sitting up in Rishikesh.
Right.
Mark and I can both attest, having been up to Rishikesh, I can see why they wrote so many songs. There's not a lot to do. Unless you like being chased by monkeys and nudged by cows. So, did you ever get nudged by cows up there?
I can't comment on that.
Okay.
Sorry. I don't discuss my private life. I'm sorry.
But being in a place like that is fantastic because, think of the world of the Beatles in 1968. The world is at their feet. Everyone wants something from them. And now you're up in this place in the foothills of the Himalayas. And it's a tiny, tiny little town. And then the ashram is, about a mile outside. So there's really nothing much to do. And except focus on maybe playing guitar, learning a little guitar technique from Donovan, and then just getting on with writing. So I think that's the gift, in a sense, too, of Rishikesh. The White Album couldn't have happened, as far as I'm concerned, without Rishikesh. They would never have had the time to just put all of these songs together.
And as Craig Bartok said on the show, that finger-picking style that he learned from Donovan, and you listen to something like Julia, it makes it so much more personal than if he'd been strumming, which is what he would have done previously.
Right. And what he did in one of the outtakes.
Right, yeah.
We associate John's songs on the album with stridency because of the way that they're attacked. In the method of recording is a lot of bite to it. The whole of the White Album, when I listen to, it's not so much the new mix, just all the outtakes, just all of it. It snaps. Every track on that album snaps. Yeah. But I think possibly all of John's songs. Were there any John songs that weren't written in Rishikesh on that album? Or were they all Rishikesh songs?
Didn't you say
Glass Onion? Yeah, Glass Onion. That would be one. But that was still written in the immediate aftermath.
Well, Revolution 9, I would imagine, was a construction, right?
But Revolution itself was written in Rishikesh.
Yes.
Yeah. But it occurs to me that actually, if you look at the lyrics, they're not so biting. Dear Prudence is actually a very beautiful thing. Prudence Farrow, in her bungalow, her chalet at the ashram, seriously meditating, meals being left for her outside her door, untouched. And after about 2-3 days, people are worried that she may be in there and, maybe even dead. So they're growing concerned about her. John Lennon he writes this song. I mean, we know that it's a song for Prudence Farrow, but can you actually put yourself in the position? He goes into her chalet, knocks on the door, and goes in with a couple of other people and strums a song to her to say, come out, it's a brand new day, the sun is shining, everything's beautiful.
Isn't that fantastic, though? Because you often think of the Beatles, couldn't give a crap.
You think of him as this hard-faced cynic, but that is a very beautiful thing to do from one human being to another, a very tender moment. Similarly, also at Rishikesh, they're away from their son Julian. We tend to think of John Lennon as not being a great father to Julian, because he said so himself and because we have other examples of it. But it's a lullaby for the son whose birthday he's missing. It's Julian's 5th birthday. It's the first birthday that they've been away for. There's a party being held for him, and he and Cynthia are missing it, John and Cynthia. So he writes this song, a beautiful, tender lullaby for his son. So when he wrote Beautiful Boy for Sean, it was not the first time he had written a song for a son. But it's on the White Album, and we think John's all hard on the White Album, and there it is.
Because he promoted Beautiful Boy that way, right?
It's
about Sean. But with Julian, he never promoted it.
Well, by the time it came out, they're estranged because he's getting a divorce. In fact, they were divorced by that point.
Yeah.
And then Julia, a song for essentially for his mother. Certainly, and whether he knew it or not, because he wasn't very good on his own chronology, 10 years exactly that year since she was killed. So 3 songs right there are very tender songs, and yet we think of John being this hard guy.
And how intensely personal Julia is, right? I mean, he's talking to his mother here and saying, I found my soulmate, basically.
Yeah.
And that's just, when people say John Lennon wasn't honest, I mean, okay, he BS like the rest of them, but when he opened up, it was like no one else.
I think he was always honest. That's the thing about John. I think he was always honest. We've had discussions this weekend about the honesty and candor of the Beatles, and there seems to be this revolving sentiment that John Lennon would said this one day and that the next day, and you couldn't really trust what he was saying. But I don't buy that. I think he was always honest, or always speaking in the moment what was in his head. I think that is honesty to me.
Yeah. Something came up. I don't know if you folks have gone through all of the discs yet. It's only been since Friday. A million years ago. One of the things that really interested me was that rehearsal version of Let It Be in that funky different style.
Yeah.
I wonder, maybe that was written in Rishikesh. Maybe that had something to do with John writing about his mom, that Paul now writes about his mom.
Except it's brother Malcolm.
Yeah, but...
Mother Mary came to him in a dream.
Yeah. No, Let It Be was written in that time frame. That's why we're hearing it like that. It's fresh.
Yeah.
Because a couple of the engineers told me that he was writing that during the White Album.
Okay, so it was after they came home.
And that's the While My Guitar Gently Weeps session, because he says about the cans on Eric.
Yeah, that's right. So it's late September. Yeah.
So if Goodnight was written for Julian in Rishikesh, which makes sense, maybe that's the 28th Escher demo that we don't have.
Right. Yeah, well, it could be. It could be. They have notebooks. One of the great advantages of this new box set is not only the audio content, but also the visual content. We're not getting a video disc, unfortunately, but there is a fantastic book with all sorts of illustrations in it, including from Paul's own collection, his notebook in which he wrote the songs. There was actually a stationery store in the ashram at Rishikesh. There was a printing press there as well. It's quite a sophisticated place in a way, though it's in the middle of a jungle. But he had a notebook in which he wrote his songs, and you can see in the new White Album box Paul's handwritten lyrics for his songs, and also John's are in there as well. He too had a notebook. So there actually were some other songs that they wrote there that they didn't demo at Kinthorns at Escher.
Paul McCartney's White Album, I mean, we've been focusing largely on John. And as I said, with Paul, it's very eclectic. But how does it speak to where he was at in 1968?
I think Paul McCartney was... I don't know what it says, actually. First of all, it says what a phenomenal songwriter he was.
Yeah.
Master of all styles, sensational vocalist, brilliant multi-instrumentalist, brilliant band member, harmony lines on everybody else's songs as well as his own.
Yeah.
I mean, one of Paul McCartney's unspoken immense gifts to the Beatles is the harmony lines he did on everybody else's songs. But as for Paul himself in 68, wow. He's been in a relationship with Jane for 5 years, which has been has reached a fairly good place by 67 because she comes back from the American theatre tour that she did in spring 67 with the Bristol Old Vic. And at Paul's request, she kind of sets the theatre aside for a while because he doesn't really want her to be doing that. They set up house together, more or less. She furnishes Cavendish Avenue. It is, and pretty much moves in. So it is their house. And then she goes to India with Paul in spring 68. When they come back at the end of March, she wants to work again. And so she is cast in a play that opens in June. And as soon as she's cast in a play, Paul starts being unfaithful to her. And he's unfaithful to her. I mean, he's been unfaithful all along, but he's unfaithful now in a way that, you know, he's sleeping with girls in their bed, in the house that she's furnished, and things are difficult, and their relationship hits the skids quite quickly. And then Yoko comes along into John's life, and that kind of derails Paul to quite a significant degree, because it's in Tune In, I write about what it was like in the Beatles for Paul, when they're not even the Beatles yet, when Stuart joins the group, when John's friend Stuart actually becomes one of the band. And literally speaking, when they were riding together on a bus in Liverpool, whereas, you know, the best seat on the bus is always upstairs because that's where you can smoke, as in A Day in the Life. But also right at the front because you've got the window right in front of you, you've got the best view. And it's always the seat to get. And initially, well, for a long time, it's been John and Paul sitting at the front with George in the seat behind, leaning forward, trying to be part of their conversation, but not quite. When Stuart joins, it's John and Stuart at the front of the bus, and Paul has to sit in the seat behind with George, and he doesn't like it, and he behaves in a way that is typical of human behavior, not particular to Paul, but he's jealous. When Yoko comes along, it's much the same thing. Paul is kind of usurped. John wants Yoko sitting next to him. He doesn't necessarily want Paul sitting there. So Paul's nose is put out of joint, and he enters a very turbulent period. He's doing a lot of pot. Has been doing coke, but isn't doing it quite so much now, I don't think. At that point, I mean. But with John and Yoko, he wants to be cool and accept her, but on the other hand, it's the Stuart situation again, and he can't. And the Jane breakup happens almost immediately. And then he gets a series of girlfriends. If you read Francis Schwartz's book Body Count, which is perfectly believable, it's not a scandal sheet, but it is tough reading if you're a Macca fan, because you get quite a good insight into his personality, very strong insight into his personality. So his world is upside down. He's lost his girlfriend. He's not lost his songwriting partner or his Beatle buddy, but he's been somewhat displaced. And yet, at the same time, he's writing beautiful songs. Yeah. And that is a real dichotomy that I haven't quite ever come to grips with, and I'm not quite sure when I will, because they don't add up. But it's what was going on.
Yeah, he's not as revealing in song, is he? As you know, John lays it all out there.
Well, that's the thing you could say about Paul. The most autobiographical thing about Paul's songs on the White Album is that he doesn't do autobiographical songs. So you learn that.
Yes.
You know, you learn, you know, that is an insight into his personality, that he can't actually do that. But what he does come up with is a whole load of incredibly interesting songs.
Yeah.
Bewitching, bewildering songs. Harmonically, they're incredible. Melodically, they're fantastic. There isn't a single thing really you could say about Paul's songs on that album that you could criticize. You may like some tracks less than others, like, say, Honey Pie or Why Don't We Do It in the Road, but they are amazing in what they are.
I do remember a time, you know, back in the UK when I was still living in England, most like the early 90s, and you were at my place, and we were talking about Paul's lyrics and, you know, his solo career and so on.
Yeah.
And I just remember at this moment when you just sat there and looked at me and went, and oh bladder, what the bloody hell was that?
I was young, Your Honour. What can I say?
Have you revised your opinion on that?
It's a story song. That's what it's about. Yeah. It's obviously a story song, the kind that they knew that Paul wrote and did very well at. It's just an observation of people. The title came from this guy he knew in London called Jimmy Scott, who used to go obla di obla da, man. with a huge joint, between his fingers. How are you, Jimmy? Obla da, life goes on, brah. And Paul, being a songwriter, thought, I'll take that.
Fantastic.
And he got paid for that as well. They slipped him some money for that.
Really?
Jimmy Scott, yeah.
I did not.
But otherwise, it's not about Paul, other than the fact that you get to learn from that song that he can write those kind of songs.
Yeah.
But it's not self-revealing.
Right.
I think it's kind of interesting that John, very shortly after this, stopped writing story songs, but here there are still some too. There's Bungalow Bill, even though it's a story that's based in reality in Rishikesh. Cry Baby Cry, it's a fantastic song, but it's not.
Alice Through the Looking Glass.
Yeah.
Cry Baby Cries goes back to 1967, doesn't it? That's when he started to write that. Yeah.
So he still has some of that Paul approach, but not quite. But it's true. There's in Paul's songs, there's a wall between Paul and the Paul projected in songs, and that is that's basically the typical songwriter thing. Songwriters don't generally sit down and say, I want to write about myself, which became John's stance, but Paul still was writing as an increasingly professional songwriter, and he knew by the time of the White Album exactly what to do.
Yeah.
And I think also he was interested, even more than the stories that he's telling, I think he's interested in the musical variety that his songs represent.
Yeah.
I think he just wants to say, I can write a 20s tune just as well as the 20s guys could.
Right.
I can write a Beach Boys song better, maybe than the Beach Boys could, but at least as good,
And he's writing for other artists as well, or giving some songs away to other artists at the same time,
I really like Thingamy Bob for the Black Dyke Mills Band.
Yeah.
What a really nice tune that is. I mean, it's a bit of English brass, a northern brass band. You have to be an Englishman really to know what that means, but it's a particularly warm, kind of nurturing sound. It's the sound of brass bands at industrial works. It's like a works band.
Yeah.
And he writes a tune for a TV signature tune for a series called Thingamy Bob, and it's just like a great brass band tune, and he goes up and conducts it as well. So, is there anything this guy can't do?
Well, that's it. I mean, you listen on the new White Album, the outtakes, and we've got Dear Prudence stripped down. And here you've got the Beatles bassist playing the drums. Yeah. And he's absolutely fantastic, I think. Like you say, what couldn't the guy do? And vocally, the isolated tracks, as you say, on other people's numbers, there's this sort of criticism that Paul was always more interested in doing his numbers. Well, yeah, but listen to what he contributes to everyone else's numbers, both musically and vocally.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Absolutely amazing. That's the thing about his album, is just the range of the music and the stunning display of his musical talents. And then between the Lennon-McCartney albums, we've also got their musical influences bleeding all over, right?
Yeah.
That's the thing, with Paul we get, sort of 1920s kind of Hollywood pastiche and music hall, and it's all there, isn't it?
Yeah, for one guy to do. I mean, I was listening to "I Will" this morning in an isolated vocal track on "I Will," and it's a beautiful high note that he holds all the way through, like the choir boy that he was. Literally, he was a church choir boy for a period of time. His voice is broken, but he can still hold a falsetto.
And the a cappella bass line.
Yeah, and then he's doing the dum 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 bass line, and then he does Helter Skelter, which would tear the throat out of anybody else. And he does take after take of it as well. I mean, he's got such great sustenance in his voice as well.
He always did an evening concert. He had better sustenance than John.
Yeah.
But also, this is the guy who recorded Yesterday and I'm Down in the same day.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So, he's absolutely on fire with this. Where do you find the weaknesses in Paul's album, Alan?
It's just that there are songs that I like less than other songs on the White Album, but it's not like we're talking about just disliking them as songs that much. I mean,
I agree with you.
Obladi is a little I don't know, it's a little light, but I may be just influenced by John's constant complaints about it. You know, I mean, because I was listening to it again on the remastered version, and probably the 5.1, and thinking, really, there's a lot going on in this song, and it's really kind of interesting in a way, and he's going after a particular style, which, like all the other styles, he has in his fingers and voice, and a certain amount of mastery, and it's he's gotten what he has aimed for. So is that a failure? I don't know. Maybe I may disagree with whether his aim should have been or should not have been, but I don't even, it's like that's Wild Honey Pie. But, again, it was sort of an experiment, off-the-cuff thing. And I kind of think there's again, listening to the remaster, thinking of a lot of these things differently than I had. And I'm thinking of Wild Honey Pie, not as exactly a counterpoint to Revolution 9, but in a way, it is, in the sense that he's doing something really kind of off the wall that wouldn't normally be on a pop album or a Beatles album, and he's experimenting with it. And
when I look back, actually, when I look at the list, when you break out Paul and you break out John, the one thing that keeps coming back to me since we've done this show is I look at Paul's list and I see animation, animation, animation. They're all like little movies. Mm-hmm. Yeah. They're very, very. It's a very cinematic approach that he took with his character development. And later in life, of course, Paul is a great champion of animation. He did some really beautiful work that is largely not thought about very much. But if you ever see that DVD of his, the animation project one where he had all of the rough stuff from Rupert and everything, it's well worth your money. It's a great evening's entertainment. But I look at this and I'm thinking, God, I'm so inspired. Like somebody should do something with this. Paul's album would be a great kids record. And maybe that's why I favored Paul's stuff. I was a kid when that came out, and I remember thinking when I eventually got the White Album, the next year, it was $7.98. That was big money, dude. But whenever I remember thinking that John's stuff was too harsh for me when I was a kid.
Really?
Yeah, it really was hard. Except for the softer, Julia.
You've always been a tender soul, haven't you?
Usually just as I'm a heel. No, enough foot joke. I put my foot in that. Anyway, so I'll stop. Anyway, I think it was as I got older that John's stuff got more and more heavy and attached to my soul. And now the most interesting thing of all, I think for all of us here, is as we revisit in 5.1, as we revisit Revolution number 9, which, I mean, a lot of people, I'm sure, it's like pristine on their original vinyl copies because people tended to skip over that. A couple of years ago, some guys I know really did a deep dive into trying to figure out every single layer in there, every recording. And the more you get into the separate bits, which of course you can appreciate now that on the DVD, on the 5.1 version, it really is incredible. And it's also incredible to think that was 50 years ago. Nobody was doing. I mean, that is sort of like music concrete, but it is just so complex and rich. And how interesting indeed that 50 years later we're starting to wake up to this track that everyone kind of went, oh man, what's that?
Well, Alan, I remember you saying on the show also that there are people who spent all their lives working on music concrete, and here John comes straight in and sort of improvises something.
Yeah, and it's better than a lot of that. I mean, as the other side of my life as a classical music critic, I've been to many, many, many concerts with music concrete pieces. And Revolution number 9, for me, I mean, if I were to do an anthology of the greatest music concrete pieces ever composed, Revolution number 9 would really be at the top of the list for me.
Really?
It's, and I don't think just because it's the Beatles. I think it kind of has a narrative arc in a weird way, and it just works. It's just sort of a brilliant compilation of sounds that you might think of as disparate, but they go together.
Right. Right.
So, yeah.
So ultimately, we come back to the thing, though. Do we think they work equally well as separate albums as they do together?
I think I'd prefer the John album if I had to only pick one.
Mm-hmm.
but Paul's works just as well in its way for his aims, to show that variety. I don't think John was that interested in that, although there's plenty of variety in his bunch of tracks, and to tell stories, and the more I listen to the reissue, and I think, I'm really thinking that this is really the value of these reissues. I love getting the outtakes and all that just to get the outtakes. But the other thing about listening to the outtakes is it's showing me a lot more about these songs than I knew before.
Right.
And so it's making me reconsider a lot of things, and things that I have thought of as throwaways, or just that I don't like them as much as other things. I'm really kind of in the process of reconsidering all of that. So I don't even know what I think about Paul's album versus John's album now.
But what about compared to the double White album?
Oh, would I think that a John White album would be better than the whole double White album?
Or do you think it matches it?
Oh, man, an album without While My Guitar Gently Weeps.
Yeah. I don't think you can do that. I think as strong as they are, you can't. I mean, it would be a great album on its own, but it wouldn't be the White Album. It'd be some other great piece of John's work.
I think it would be more satisfying a John White album than the single disc White album that George Martin was suggesting. A really strong. I don't know. I think the consistency in John's album makes that a really, really, really strong album.
Yeah,
what would you cut? Mark, you probably speak to this a lot better. George Martin famously would say that he thought it should have been reduced to a single album. What on earth are you cutting from that?
Well, the reasons for George saying that are different to the ones that we might think anyway, because it's not just necessarily about 16 of these tracks aren't good enough, which might be what he was kind of saying, that you've got a top tier and a second tier. For a start, he was a busy producer, so he didn't necessarily want to be booking 6 months or 5 months out of his own schedule just for the Beatles. He wanted to do other things. So that would have been a reason for saying, why don't we just make it a single album? Because he'd be finished earlier. That would be one thing. The second thing is that the way that George Martin judged a song as a piece of music that ought to be recorded is different to the way that we would all judge one. And I did have the opportunity many times with George. We did the anthology projects together, and I sat through outtakes that I considered to be very strong and worthy of being included on Anthology 1 or 2 or 3, and he would go, "Oh, that was rubbish." And his criteria for judging it would be completely different to mine. So because he had different ears and had different sensibility about what a track should be. So I couldn't possibly cut 16 or longer tracks. I mean, the Beatles always thought 14 tracks for an album. Whenever, that was always the magic number in their head. When they've got 10 in the can, they go, okay, we've got 4 more to do. When they've got 11 in the can, we've got 3 more to do. So 14 was the number. I don't think a 14-track White Album was possible because they're longer now. So say the single disc White Album is about 12 tracks. Then you've got to cut 18 tracks from the White Album. I couldn't cut any.
Right.
I really couldn't. So, but George Martin said that for other reasons. Another one was that he felt excluded from the decision-making process. I mean, he was an A&R man. The R stands for repertoire, because in his job, he would actually have to choose the songs that the artist is going to do. That's the A for artist and the R for repertoire. Well, before he's even heard any of the tracks, he's reading Paul McCartney in Melody Maker saying, we've got 30 tracks, and we're going to do 2 albums, and maybe even 3. Well, so he has no say. So he's been emasculated from that. You're welcome, George. Please come in. We want to work with you. But this is what we're doing, George. So his decision-making on that, and the reason why he said it should be a single disc, is not just what we might think to be an obvious one. It's layered and complex and tied in with their relationship and his diminishing role.
What about his suspicion, which he expressed to me, which was that they were contractually with EMI, it was not only dependent on the term of the contract, but also the number of songs.
Yeah.
And he felt that they were putting out that number of songs to more quickly fulfill the contract.
Yeah, the contract that Brian Epstein negotiated in January 67, or was signed in January 67, called for, it was a 9-year contract, it would expire in 76, but it called for a minimum of 70 tracks. Well, 70 tracks, which was a shrewd bit of negotiating by Brian Epstein, that's 5 albums, 5 14s are 70. And that doesn't even count the singles. So it's probably 4 14s and some singles. Well, the Beatles were typically recording 2 albums a year. So by 69, they were likely to have fulfilled that. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. And that's why Alan Klein had the strength to renegotiate the contract. Because though they were still tied to EMI until 76, if they didn't want to, they need not have recorded any more. Of course, they had to because they were artists and they were writing. But that was a strong position they were in. Tony Bramwell, who was around the Beatles throughout the making of the White Album, told me a long time ago that he remembered them saying, with regard to this 70-song clause in the contract, that it's like 65 down, 5 to go. It's like they really were aware of that number.
I'm amazed because we were talking recently about how what they usually did was creative, right? They weren't coming at it from the business angle.
Yeah.
They were musicians. They loved the art.
Yeah.
So this is interesting.
Well, it is. Obviously, they were going to continue to create. But as I said, this is why Alan Klein had such a strong hand. He never acknowledged Brian Epstein's help in giving him that strong hand to renegotiate the contract. But that's exactly what it was. Yeah.
You know, we may be asking the wrong question about, there's been a lot of focus at various panels here about how would you do a one-disc White Album. Maybe the question really should be if, going from Paul McCartney's comments in Melody Maker and the available materials, if you had a 3-disc White
Absolutely.
I
Album,
would have loved it.
how would you sequence it? Where would you put Not Guilty, and where would you put? And let's say that would also include if they had done Circles in the studio and Sour Milk Sea themselves and stuff like that.
Well, that's a tragedy they didn't do Sour Milk Sea. If you listen to that backing track, anyone, you Google that somebody took the demo and floated it over the backing track and removed Jackie Lomax's vocal. And even though it's an approximation, you get a pretty damn nice result. So that was a tragedy. They should have used that one.
Yeah, but it's true. I mean, that's the way I'd be going. If anything, would have been a triple album.
Yeah.
There's enough material for sure, and now that's really revealed itself in 5.1.
Where the Beatles are concerned, less is never more. More is most. More is most.
Yeah, it is.
Well, if they had done that, another thing revealed in the new box set would, if you go to a 3-disc set, maybe that means is it like one side going to be blank? I know what they could have done with that side if they didn't have enough songs, and all you had to do was to hear "You're So Square, Baby, I Don't Care."
Right.
If they had just filled that what a tragedy that they didn't just do oldies right then and there, right as that session ended, because they were on fire, and everything that Get Back should have been is encapsulated in that one little track that they gave us, "You're So Square." There's no way that band sounds divided, and if they're just kind of ripping that off in between takes, give me more of that.
That's Hamburg on steroids.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just
Incredibly
amazing.
good.
And it's interesting, actually, on that subject for a second, about those jam sessions. They're all, the ones that we've got, at least, they're all led by Paul, which is kind of where we get to during the Get Back sessions, isn't it?
Yeah. I think that was the first thought that we all had when we heard You're So Square. It's just like, how come they can do this in September 68 and in January 69 they can't do it at all?
Right.
And that is a subject for a symposium in itself. Yeah. What happened between the end of the White Album and the start of the next one? Because there's a decay there that's quite obvious. So what happened? Yeah. Another symposium.
Well, there are several bands that, King Crimson comes to mind, where they figured out, we record this album and then we go out on the road, and by the time we're finished on the road, the album sounds much better. So some bands would take the road band, or after they'd done their new material on live, and then go in the studio. Yeah. I wonder if it's a little of that at work. They've been working on this thing for months and months and months, no layoff, and now they're ready to do an oldies record. They just didn't realize. Maybe one of the very few times they made the wrong decision.
Yeah.
During the making of this album, they decided that they would go back on stage. And that they were booking halls, if you can believe what you read, and there is a lot of truth to it. Either the London Albert Hall, the Royal Albert Hall, or the Roundhouse, a strange little place in London, a round building where a lot of experimental stuff was done, and they were going to go on stage and play before an audience again immediately after finishing this album. So what would their set list have been? It is very much a what if, because it didn't happen, but in the last 4 weeks of making the White Album, they are accepting of the position that before the year is out, they'll be on stage together, and they're going to be playing tracks. Now, even though the Beatles did things unexpectedly, being that they had a new album out at the last week of November, if they're on stage in December, surely they're going to be playing tracks from that album. Right. So we could have very easily had a position where they were actually on stage playing this before the year of 68 was out. And it was only when that got shunted forward into 69 that it then didn't work as an idea anymore.
So ultimately, does it actually tell us, listening to John's White Album and Paul's White Album, that it was better to merge them? I know about George and Ringo's tracks as well, but just as a concept, do you think it would match the concept of the combined album to have separate albums?
I just don't know. I mean, part of what makes a Beatles album, any album, work as well as it does is the contrast between the John and the Paul songs, and George when there is.
Yeah.
But in the way they play off each other, even though the list of John songs is great and would make a great John solo album, I don't think it's entirely as great as the White Album as a thing.
I think for me it's more like if I just want full-on Lennon, in full cry, then I have that on the playlist, and I'll just listen to. It's like, let's just cut to the quick here and get him full on.
I think the combined efforts produced something that is just startlingly incredible. Even now, I think it's probably leapfrogged Revolver and has become my favorite. And I think it's just, especially this new remaster, I don't know if you guys all feel the same. For me, suddenly this album sounds very modern. Like very alive, very like they're here and everyone's alive again. And, it's very, they did an excellent job. Giles, if you're listening, you did a hell of a job on both the stereo and the 5.1.
Yeah.
But, I don't, speaking of 5.1, do you guys, anybody here have the Yellow Submarine DVD? Did you ever go in? All right. Did you ever go in and shut off the dialogue and just listen to the music? And you can listen to that in 5.1 too. Yeah. Eleanor Rigby. So it's, I don't know why. I wonder if, how many people have a 5.1 system? Okay, so pretty much everybody.
Yeah. For me, I just feel that as we found out when they broke up, that the Beatles were greater than the sum of their parts. So the John album is superb. The Paul album is superb. George and Ringo's tracks, which don't make a whole album, are strong in themselves. But when you plug them all in together, when you integrate them, then there's this extra thing, which is you've got all that talent and all that music, but the combination is always stronger than the individual components.
And what do you think about, the fact that now we just play it straight through, as opposed to having to flip the disc and have the opening track and the closing track?
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that diminishes the experience in terms of what they intended?
Well, it's certainly blurred the business of having a strong beginning and a strong ending to each side.
Yeah.
And that's true. That's the whole CD era for all albums made pre-1983.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it was always a key part of producing is to, what's your opening track, what's your closing track, where's your dividing line. So that's gone. But I think I hear it in my head anyway.
Yeah.
When I hear "Happiness Is a Warm Gun" and that final drum, I know it's the end of side one. I know I've got to flip it over.
Yeah.
But to me, there was always quite a distinct feeling between the four sides. And I always felt, I have never tested this scientifically, but I always felt that the most played parts of the White Album were sides 1 and 2. The sides 3 and 4 probably were on people's turntables a little bit less, and probably side 4 least of all, because it had Revolution 9 on it, and also because the more accessible songs are those that you want to have on discs 1 and 2. So I think side 4 is probably the last 15, 20 minutes of the White Album is the least known aspect of the album. But I quite often play discs on shuffle anyway, so it doesn't really make any difference.
It's interesting that you say that you play them on shuffle, but also that you think of them as distinct sides, because when Mark, I played the 5.1 for Mark, and I think we listened to it a couple of times, and I think both times, at the end of each side, you said, put it on pause. And we had like a little break, a little more than you would take to flip over the record, but it was really 4 distinct sides.
Did you have a needle scratch in there?
No, we didn't. I probably could have arranged for that.
The break was because I wanted to talk about it. I really, really wanted to talk about what we had heard. And if we'd gone straight into yet another track, I wouldn't have a chance to emote over what I'd been listening to, which I really did want to do. That was a great experience. Here it's 5.1. I don't know if anybody knows that, but
and Alan's got a 5.1.
And I was going around the room sticking my heads inside the loudspeakers, inside the loudspeakers, trying to catch everything that I possibly could. It was a hugely rewarding experience.
Yeah,
same for me.
Over here, listen to Paul's bass.
Yeah,
and then he'd move on to the next speaker. I'd catch what he was listening to.
I remember, like on Piggies, Paul's bass. He kind of plays his bass in a way that grunts.
Yeah,
I mean, you can't really catch that in the conventional stereo, but when you actually listen to just the bass, it's like he's pulling it in such a way that it grunts like a pig. So brilliant.
Yeah, and you can hear the fingering on the strings and everything as well in the 5.1.
Yeah. How can an album 50 years old sound so modern?
Because it's timeless.
Yeah. Okay. Boom, boom. Yeah, you got it.
I was thinking I should convince Universal not to put out the 5.1 mix so that all my friends have to come to my house.
Exactly. You're all welcome.